So Ella, my colleague here, has two mics, roving mics. So what we're going to do is, the speakers are all mic'd up already. I think that's correct. So you should be able to hear them. So I'm just going to sit alongside here. And as I say, please feel free. This is a very informal, even though we're all sitting in rows. This is not intended to be an examination either of the speakers or in any way, but just to raise thoughts that you had, things that, because we've all come from different perspectives here. So would anybody like, as I say, no particular order, there's no particular agenda in who, but yes, there's a lady here at the end of the row. And
I would like to ask Marcus, he talks about the individuality of Stubbs's paintings. I think Stubbs is amazing for all the obvious reasons, but I don't see his paint depictions as individual. They're mostly all thoroughbreds, presumably because that was what he was commissioned to do. I see the individual and the character of horses much more in Munnings, who depicted gypsy ponies, beautiful royal carriage horses, great big cart horses, and all the way the people resonated with them as seeing as horses as individuals far more than Munnings. I just wondered what your thoughts were.
I think the point that Stubbs was commissioned to paint these animals. I think that if we look at remember the Hambleton rubbing down picture, that was the last Stubbs one I showed. There was a sense of extreme difference between that animal and the people who were holding it. And we're not so interested in the individual personalities of the people. And maybe we're not interested in the individual personality of that horse. What I'm interested in when I look at that is the individual expression and even suffering of that horse. The fact that it's just run this enormous race, and it's necessarily frustrated. It's necessarily not at ease, and I'm interested in that being evoked as an individual concern. It's not that I can relate to as an individual. It's not really necessarily about its personality. It's about its individual state of mind. So, gentlemen, here in this row.
Thanks. I think this thought is, and I'm not sure it's a question, so forgive me, but it's sparked by a combination of something which Helen said and also Marcus's comments. I mean, I was particularly interested in your use of James Thompson's Winter, because all the time I was going round the exhibition, I kept thinking of the last book of Gulliver's Travels and the Houyhnhnms and the Yahoos. Now, that's a few years earlier than Stubbs, but it's still in that same territory of how can we understand, and that's your world in a way, Marcus, how can we do that empathy? So I don't know whether Stubbs had read Swift. I don't know whether there's some other literary, artistic parallels that we can start to draw, but I just, the whole exhibition kept reminding me of Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's that series of paintings by Saury Gilpin of the Houyhnhnms, where the anthropomorphizes, if that's the right word, the horses themselves, which have the spirit of humans. And so I think it's funny. I hadn't thought of it in the present context, but I think you're absolutely right. That is a very important thread that runs through, and if the others.
Well, Pennant definitely refers to Swift's Gulliver's Travels throughout his writing, so there's definitely a reference to Swift's kind of fantastical environments that he writes about. But in a way, for me, reading Thompson, the way that Pennant refers to Thompson gives a kind of credence, a kind of authority to using these objects of the natural world in paintings, and to take them seriously in a way rather than see them as being periphery and on the margins of painting. So that was what was important, and also to try to understand, because in some ways referring to people to the kind of fantastical views of the fictional worlds of Swift removes the studies from a kind of objectivity that these naturalists were trying to promote. So again, kind of use these are fictional worlds, and sometimes that, for me, that kind of fictional representation was kind of misunderstood. I think when we read Pennant nowadays, it can read as a kind of colonial lens. You know, there's but bringing that sort of understanding of Thomson into the language, I think, alongside the images, was for me made that to, you know, kind of removed that mistake. So he's anthropomorphized. Pennant and others are anthropomorphizing, but not to kind of say, oh, these savages, you know, but to actually say, to empathize, as Marcus was saying, that kind of showing that kind of will to understand the human and animal relationship. So sorry, I don't know if that's answered your question, but thank you.
Yes, the gentleman halfway up.
Hi. I was wondering whether you could help me interpret the pictures you've been putting up this morning. It's not just Stubbs, but every other artist from that era. In that the animals are never in the landscape. They're on it. They don't seem to touch the ground. They rarely cast a shadow. And obviously it was the modus operandi in that time. But could you help me interpret that? Understand why they're presented that way?
Are you thinking of something like the Whistle Jacket painting?
No, not the Whistle Jacket. No, I understand why you present Whistle Jacket in that way, and it's kind of helpful. But the ones that are put into landscapes, the moose, you know, every other picture we've seen today, they're never really part of that landscape.
So you're saying they're kind of posed in that landscape?
Yeah, yes, exactly.
It's an artificial construction.
Yes, yeah. They never make. There's no footprints or hoof prints leading up to where they are.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation, isn't it? Because with Stubbs, there's this curious. On the one hand, they're intensely real and physical, but they are at one hand removed, and that's sometimes why we feel, whether rightly or wrongly, that there's a timelessness about them. As you say, there's not much dirt, there's not much, some occasionally, but I think it's because there is this classical aspect of Stubbs. You know, there is the ideal, and sometimes they're almost like relief sculptures across a surface. You know, and you can sort of take them out of that landscape. You know, there is a relief kind of. At least that's how I sometimes think of them. So it's that strange combination of something that's intensely real. You know, whether it's the flickering of a horse's ear or something, but something that's removed from reality at the same time. Stubbs is very sophisticated. I mean, that's the one of the way he did it. But I mean, other artists not so much. An artist like James Seymour, for example, earlier in the 18th century, where the animals really do, you feel, are against that background. I don't know how that strikes others.
Yes, I mean, from what I've studied, animal painters understood that their trade was to depict the animal, and often it was a commission, as you were saying, to depict a particular creature, or that was what the person was buying it for. But they did put in, and as you're saying, some of them are more skilled at putting in the landscape around than others. And it's also a change, isn't it, in art? So Munnings, who you mentioned, was painting en plein air, and there are artists who make a very important point about, Stephen Pearce, I mentioned, says that you have to have your horse in the stable in front of you, control the light that's coming in. You have to think about the end picture, and not all of them were thinking about that, but some of them certainly were. It's a changing taste. So Munnings is influenced by Impressionism and that sort of thing. Is far more interested in getting them in the landscape than the earlier artists were.
Does the lady just... do you want to get the...
Joshua Reynolds?
Just get the microphone. Sorry, could I just get the mic, because then everybody can hear what you're saying.
I was just asking, was that the point that Sir Joshua Reynolds was making, that depicting exactly what you saw in nature was not enough. You needed more than that to make a great painting.
Yes, I think. Sorry, I think that's. I mean, for me, the question about the landscape and the kind of environment that these animals were existed in and inhabited was part of the tension that the painters felt between what they should depict and what they shouldn't depict, what's objective and what's subjective, and what kind of, I think, for me, understanding Reynolds is that subjective impulse, if you like, in an artist should be kind of, I'm sorry, I say this in front of Martin, but, should be kind of suppressed in a way, and that the subjective experience can't interfere with the depiction on the canvas. And I think that for animal painting, because there's this, the idea of this image as being production of spreading the production of knowledge of the natural world, there's a kind of tension that they should be decontextualized almost from their environment. So that's why you do get the anatomy of the gravid uterus, displayed in such a kind of, kind of dramatic fashion. It's taking, sorry, I kind of might be rambling a bit here, but it's taking that away from sorry, I think your question is about that, the kind of ideas that Reynolds was trying to argue to take away that kind of subjective feeling, if you like, in a painting, but also, but for Stubbs and for Hunter, for Pennant, Thomas Pennant, it was almost a kind of natural, something that they couldn't suppress, or when they tried to suppress it was quite awkward. I mean, Pennant talks about seal culls in Caithness in Scotland, and he described it so vividly, and then because he doesn't have an artist with him at that point to depict this horrible event, he has to rely on some taxidermy seals from Oxford in the museum there. So it takes away from that idea of knowledge. It kind of diminishes it from those images when that subjective experience isn't on the canvas or on the etching or on the drawing. Sorry, I don't know if that's.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You touched on a very important historical point in one sense because both Reynolds and Hunter are at the heart of the Academy. Reynolds is the president and William Hunter is the professor of anatomy. We all know that painting by Johann Zoffany, I'm sure, in the Royal Collection, where the two men are at the centre. But they represent two very different discourses, and there was a great deal of tension within the Academy, and it increased and ratcheted up in the 70s into the 80s, into the 90s, at the very period when Stubbs was working, between the validity of investigation through anatomy, direct section, the sort of thing that was at the heart of Stubbs did, and the ideal, the paradigms that are handed down through generations from time immemorial, going back to the Romans and ultimately the Greeks. And without going into detail, Reynolds' discourses, the lectures he gave at the Royal Academy, and Hunter's discourses were in very many ways diametrically opposed, and they had to cover up the cracks. Increasingly, as you move into the late 18th century, those cracks become fissures, and the whole idea of the role of anatomy within the Academy and in terms of artistic endeavour becomes a very controversial subject. So, for example, in the early 19th century, they appoint a man called Anthony Carlyle as professor of anatomy. Carlyle himself doesn't actually think that artists should do anatomy. He's very much against it. And yet there are others who are kind of enticing artists out of the Academy, people like the Lanciers, and they're actually setting up alternative art anatomy classes because they're not getting that within the Academy. All that is bubbling up at the very time that Stubbs is producing his work. And so to me, Stubbs is fascinating. He is at once the most academic of all British artists in the period in terms of what he represents, and yet he's on the fringes at the same time. And I just want to ask a question, because you began, Marcus, by talking about your time at the Royal Academy Schools and the fact that you studied life drawing and anatomy. Did you feel, whenever, however many years ago you're doing it, that that was something unfashionable, conservative, that it was something that would be frowned upon in certain quarters?
Deeply unfashionable.
I thought so.
Well, this was the time when the YBAs, the Young British Artist, Damien Hirst, was coming to fruition, and I was sitting there in the life room, life drawing, and it seemed like a strange anachronism, really, and very odd. But I think there is this almost link to Damien Hirst. There is a sort of link with Stubbs in that way, and Reynolds. Reynolds, I think, his master was art. That was his great teacher. That was the Academy's great teacher. But someone like Stubbs and Nancy, I think their teacher and their god in that sense was nature. And there's a different focus really on where you imagine yourself within that relationship, I think.
There's a gentleman, yes, there, thank you.
I'm extremely interested in Marcus's concept of becoming horse, and it seems to me that the merit of going down that approach is that it highlights the tension between the animal and the human, and I think I do see one really problem area, and that comes down to the concept of consciousness. For example, in one of the paintings downstairs, there is a jockey preparing to mount a horse which is going to run in a race. The jockey, the human, and the groom with it, they know the risks that that horse is going to take during that race. It may break a leg and have to be put down, or it may suffer a heart attack and die from exertion. All that the horse knows, I would argue, is that it's going to run with the herd or to do what it has been trained to do by humans. It has absolutely no knowledge of mortality or possible injury and death from the sport. And I say that as a great lover of Stubbs and a great lover of horse racing.
Well, I would say he was concerned with exactly that same issue. I think, is it well known that he didn't actually like horse racing, and he frowned upon it. And I think the levelling of hierarchy that I talked about, in a way, socially, historically, that was sort of weirdly happening. The owners were presenting these horses as reflections of themselves. They were saying, these animals have status, they have pedigree, they have breeding, just like us. You know, we are similar in that way. But in the same sentence, they'd say, yes, but we'd kill it if it broke its leg. That's not making that horse into a human. That's making the horse into a strange commodity still. It's not a levelling at all. But I think Stubbs understood that levelling on a different level, on a very on a sense of being level, on a human-animal consciousness level. Maybe that's too much of a big word for that experience, but it's that shared sense of being is what I was trying to talk about.
Yes, just
Good morning. I didn't know about this wonderful conference until this morning at about 6 a.m, and I feel very pleased to be here and was utterly thrilled to see this exhibition last week. And looking out of this window, I live probably 13, 14 miles away in North Bedfordshire. And I actually, similarly a bit to you, I was at the Slade and did life classes at the RA. And I'm somebody who's grown up uncompetitively in my lifetime, having a donkey, a pony, being able to ride, and coming with a lot of experiences to see this exhibition and a lot of points of view that may or may not be relevant. But I wanted to point out to people who might be here who don't know this area that a lot of this is along the River Ouse, in that I noticed, which I hadn't realised before, that Stubbs' father was actually a leather tanner, And along the River Ouse, Newport Pagnell is the home of where vellum is produced for all the royal acts. The village that I've grown up in along the River Ouse had several leather working places that have all gone. And this area is the area of Bedford and Buckingham and Northampton, who would have been, you know, you go back Tudors, medieval, Stuarts, Jacobean. There's a very, very rich heritage, and interesting hearing you. I'm half Scottish, half Irish, and I really enjoyed hearing your comments from a Scottish perspective and of all these amazing Scotsmen who were wanting to authentically record and discover the world at that time. And I would be fascinated to know how many people who visited this exhibition who are actually more experienced of the equine and what's under our feet. And the gentleman just in front of me who talked about horses looking as if they were transposed into landscapes. It fascinated me looking at the stallions who are all shod and the brood mares that aren't shod because they're not going to be racing or going on hard ground. It would be so interesting to know all the equine peoples and the landowners' points of view and what how they see this as well, and as well as, you know, all the interesting academic views that are coming out. But I always think at this time in the planet, and I've grown up seeing Milton Keynes, the village I'm in, what is now a country park was a gravel pit. And as a teenager, suddenly this Milton Keynes is here and it's very exciting. And now it looks very established. I mean, there were over 1 million saplings planted in the 60s, I think, before anything was actually built. And another thing that I would love to see now is if somebody who was a good rider could give distances and times of routes around here. I mean, Ampthill, which had a palace by Henry VIII, which is now demolished, is only 11 miles away. Woburn is probably only half a dozen miles away. You know, Buckingham, all these famous names and these shires, all interesting stuff and important time, as you said, on our planet now.
Thank you very much. And I mean, absolutely, as a non-horse person, barely, I think I went on one at the seaside once. That's about it. But I do have horsey friends, and some of them are here today, who'd ride horses, and very large horses, and feel their breath and everything that goes with them. And I think the obvious thing is in the 18th century, everybody knew horses at close hand. The streets of London were full of them. People rode them. Joshua Reynolds rode a horse. He went to his house in Richmond on a horse, and he wasn't, think of Reynolds as a sportsman. But at Ampthill, that's right, absolutely. So there is that close knowing the animals in the way that we just don't, and that's a fundamental difference. You know, even if you're not Stubbs, and even if you approved of horse racing and the turf and everything else, you had that close visceral connection that we don't have. We've got a few more minutes. We do have 1 or 2 minutes. Maybe one more question, if there is. Lady, and there's two of you there. Maybe we can manage to squeeze in a couple. Yeah.
Thank you to all three speakers. I really enjoyed your presentation. So I'll make this just a very quick question. I was very interested, Alison, in your arguments around categorisations and the animal portrait painter, sporting art and so on. And also, Helen, the way you picked up on that in relation to the natural world. But Marcus, I wondered how you saw, or how others see your work in relation to those categories. Are you seen as an animal portrait painter, a photographer, a performance artist? You know, are any comparisons made between your work and the period that Alison and Helen have been talking about?
Well, I think that alludes to our capacity to want to pigeonhole everything, and art's no exception in that. Yes, I often get sort of presented as a sort of British artist, the British artist who works with animals, and lots of people don't know I do lots of other things as well. I've heard people come out of an exhibition of mine saying, "Wow, he doesn't just do birds." So there's a sense that I think we all love to categorise, and we all want to pigeonhole and know someone by their realm in a way. So I do feel often quite labelled by an animal artist, yes. And there's an extraordinary sort of upsurge in interest in artists that are involved in this animal-human relationship at the moment. I mean, it's an international thing. So there's been a big upsurge in international interest in my work because of that. And I think that's because of the times we live in and what we're facing ecologically. But yeah, I try to resist those things, but it's quite difficult.
And then we have, there's another lady who wanted to.
I just have a question, not about Stubbs, but about Charles Town, because it was the only picture shown today of an interior. And I just wondered if there were many more like that, because to me it seemed much more real, going back to the question about the horses sort of floating in a landscape rather than being situated in their normal lives. And I just wondered if there were many interiors like that.
Well, yes, there are a lot. Town was in that painting, he's sort of working a bit in the style of George Morland, who was hugely popular at the time and was well known for his interiors of stables. There's quite a lot of, we've been talking about this kind of horsey culture and people who know horses, and there are a lot of paintings of horses inside stables with their tack, just standing outside, riding houses with their grooms. We know that Stubbs shows horses with the grooms quite a lot, but some of those are inside as well. There's a lot of, this is sort of what I was getting at, there's a lot of material out there that's a lot less well known, although if you go to any gallery, they're likely to have something of that sort.
Well, it's coming up to, I'm going to, Rikin, just, yeah.
I just wanted to ask Marcus, those three people who became the yellowhammer, the wren and the pheasant, when you played it back to them, and well, how did they feel about the experience?
Well, I filmed them actually on another camera doing the slowed down bird song. So I filmed them making off the dawn chorus. And I interviewed them about the experience of actually doing the singing. And while they were doing the singing, they sort of felt like they sort of entered into this other sort of dream state or meditation, but they saw no connection between the sounds they were making and the birdsong at all. So when they heard the birdsong speeded up, when they heard their voices speeded up at the end, they were astonished, absolutely astonished.
Sure. I won't do my birdsong imitation. I'm actually quite good at it. But it's coming up, it's quarter past.